The man in the tailored Italian suit thought humiliating a waitress would earn him a few laughs that evening. But before the night was over, he would become the one everyone remembered for the wrong reason. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below. And if you believe dignity matters more than appearances, be sure to like and subscribe. Stories like this remind us that first impressions are often the most expensive mistakes. The evening rush had transformed Hawthorne's steakhouse into a sea of polished glass, warm amber light, and quiet wealth. Crystal chandeliers reflected off dark mahogany walls while soft jazz drifted through the dining room. Outside, a light spring rain tapped gently against the tall windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Inside, executives celebrated promotions, investors discussed deals worth millions, and tourists snapped photos of their perfectly plated dinners. Moving gracefully between the crowded tables was Emily Carter, a 38-year-old waitress whose simple black uniform made her nearly invisible to most guests. Her blonde hair was tied neatly into a low ponytail, and her calm blue eyes rarely lingered on anyone for long. She carried trays with effortless balance, remembered complicated orders without writing them down, and greeted every customer with the same warm smile. Yet most people never truly saw her. To them, she was simply the waitress. Someone who refilled water glasses and cleared empty plates. Someone who existed quietly in the background. At table 17 sat Richard Calloway, a well-known venture capitalist whose reputation for success was matched only by his reputation for arrogance. His expensive watch gleamed beneath the restaurant lights every time he lifted his wine glass. Around him sat several business associates, all eager to laugh at his jokes and agree with his opinions. Richard enjoyed attention. More importantly, he enjoyed reminding others of their place. As Emily approached the table carrying a tray of drinks, Richard barely looked up from his conversation. Finally, he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "I was beginning to think our waitress got lost." A few people chuckled. Emily offered a polite smile and carefully placed each drink in front of the guests. "Thank you for your patience, sir." Richard leaned back in his chair and studied her for a moment. There was something about her calm expression that irritated him. Most people reacted when he spoke. Most people tried to impress him. She simply continued doing her job. "Tell me," Richard said, raising his voice again, "do they teach mind reading in waitress school?" You remembered everyone's order without writing anything down. More laughter followed. Emily remained composed. "Just experience, sir." "Experience," Richard repeated with a smirk. "Well, that's one way to avoid college debt." The laughter grew louder this time. Several nearby diners turned toward the table. Emily felt dozens of eyes settle on her, waiting for a reaction. But she simply nodded once and continued serving the drinks. Her calmness only seemed to encourage him. Richard glanced around the room, enjoying the attention. "You know what I admire most?" he said dramatically. "Confidence, even when it's completely unsupported." The room responded with scattered amusement. Emily stood quietly for a moment before excusing herself and walking away. Behind her, another wave of laughter rolled through the dining room. Richard smiled, convinced he had just become the most entertaining person in the restaurant. What he didn't notice was the older gentleman seated alone near the back window. The man had stopped eating entirely. His eyes followed Emily as she disappeared into the kitchen. And when Richard's voice echoed through the restaurant once more, the elderly man slowly set down his fork and shook his head as if he knew something everyone else had missed. Something that would soon change the entire evening. The dinner rush continued to swell as rain streaked the restaurant windows, turning the city lights outside into blurred ribbons of gold and white. Inside the kitchen, the steady rhythm of clattering pans and quiet instructions filled the air. Emily moved through it all with the calm precision of someone who had done the same job thousands of times, while other servers rushed from station to station, checking handwritten notes and asking questions. Emily seemed to remember every detail effortlessly. Table 12 needed dressing on the side. Table 9 had a severe nut allergy. Table 20 requested sparkling water instead of still. She carried each detail in her mind as naturally as breathing. "You always make it look easy," said Megan, a younger waitress balancing a tray of appetizers. Emily smiled. "After enough years, most things become easier." Megan laughed. "Not that easy." Before Emily could answer, the restaurant manager stepped into the service area. Emily, table 17, wants another bottle of the reserve Cabernet. The mention of Richard Calloway's table caused several employees to exchange uncomfortable looks. Everyone had heard his comments. Everyone had seen the way he treated her. Yet Emily simply nodded. I will take care of it. As she retrieved the wine, a distinguished-looking gentleman near the wine display watched her closely. He appeared to be in his 70s, dressed in a charcoal suit with a silver tie. Unlike the other diners, he was not looking at her uniform. He was studying her face. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The man's expression changed slightly, almost as if he recognized something. Then he returned to his meal. Emily continued toward table 17. Richard was now entertaining his guests with stories about acquisitions and investments. His voice carried easily through the room. Success comes from knowing who belongs in the room and who does not, he declared confidently. Several people nodded. Others laughed politely. As Emily poured the wine, Richard glanced at her again. There she is. His smile returned. Tell me something. Have you worked here long? 7 years, sir, Emily answered. 7 years. Richard raised his eyebrows dramatically. That is dedication. One of his associates chuckled. Or a lack of options. More laughter followed. Emily finished pouring the wine without responding. Yet before she stepped away, the older gentleman near the back suddenly stood from his table. The movement was subtle, but several nearby diners noticed. He walked slowly toward the front of the restaurant, passing only a few feet from Richard's table. As he did, he paused briefly and looked directly at Emily. Good evening, Miss Carter, he said warmly. Emily appeared surprised. Good evening, sir. The man smiled. It has been many years. Then he continued walking toward the exit. A hush seemed to linger in the air after he left. Richard frowned slightly. Friend of yours? Emily hesitated for only a moment. Someone I knew a long time ago. Richard smirked. Interesting. But across the room, several diners had noticed something else. The older gentleman was not just any customer. He was Charles Whitmore, a respected philanthropist whose name appeared regularly in national business publications. And for reasons nobody understood, one of the most influential men in Chicago had just addressed a waitress with unmistakable admiration. The moment Charles Whitmore disappeared through the front doors, the atmosphere inside the restaurant subtly changed. Conversations resumed, glasses clinked, and waiters continued moving between tables, yet a quiet current of curiosity lingered beneath it all. Several guests exchanged glances. Everyone in Chicago's business community knew who Charles Whitmore was. He was the founder of one of the largest charitable foundations in the Midwest, a man whose endorsements could launch careers and whose opinion carried weight in boardrooms across the country. The fact that he had greeted a waitress by name was unusual enough. The respect in his voice was what truly caught people's attention. Richard noticed it too. He swirled the wine in his glass and watched Emily walk back toward the service station. Something about the interaction bothered him. It challenged the simple story he had already constructed in his mind. He preferred categories. Successful people belonged in one group. Ordinary people belonged in another. Emily fit neatly into the second category. Or at least she had until a few moments ago. One of Richard's associates leaned closer. Do you know Whitmore personally? Richard asked casually when Emily returned to check the table. Not personally, Emily answered. I met him years ago. Years ago? Where? Richard asked. Emily offered a polite smile. At an event. Her answer only deepened the mystery. Richard hated mysteries he could not immediately solve. Before he could press further, activity near the front entrance drew attention across the dining room. A restaurant employee adjusted a microphone stand that had been set up beside the grand piano. Several guests straightened in their chairs. Tonight happened to be the annual Hawthorne Scholarship fundraiser, a prestigious event that would begin later in the evening after regular dinner service. Many of the city's wealthiest business leaders attended every year. Richard smiled when he remembered. His company was one of the event's major sponsors. Now that should be entertaining, he said. A room full of accomplished people. One of his guests laughed. Your favorite kind of audience. Meanwhile, Emily quietly continued working. She cleared plates, delivered desserts, and refilled coffee cups. Yet several guests now found themselves watching her. The strange encounter with Charles Whitmore had planted a question in their minds. Who was she really? Near the kitchen entrance, Megan approached her again. You never told me you knew Charles Whitmore. Emily shook her head gently. There is not much to tell. A billionaire philanthropist remembers your name after years, and there is not much to tell. Megan whispered. Emily simply smiled and continued polishing silverware. Her calmness made the mystery even larger. Across the room, Richard's attention shifted when the event coordinator stepped onto the small stage beside the piano. The microphone crackled softly before her voice filled the restaurant. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for tonight's scholarship fundraiser. We have a very special surprise planned for later this evening. Applause echoed through the room. Richard leaned back confidently. He loved being at the center of important events. What he did not know was that the surprise waiting for everyone in that room was far closer than he imagined. And before the night ended, the person he had dismissed so easily would become impossible to ignore. The fundraiser officially began. 20 minutes later, the restaurant lights dimmed slightly, leaving the chandeliers glowing like clusters of stars above the dining room. Conversations softened as guests turned their attention toward the small stage near the grand piano. Waitstaff moved quietly between tables, collecting final dinner plates while donors and executives settled into their seats. The event coordinator stepped back to the microphone with a polished smile. Tonight we celebrate educational excellence and the power of opportunity, she announced. Applause rippled across the room. Richard joined in confidently. He had attended dozens of events like this and believed he knew exactly how the evening would unfold. Speeches, donations, recognition, networking, the usual rituals of influence and success. What he did not expect was for his attention to keep drifting back toward Emily. She was helping another server organize dessert trays near the kitchen entrance. Calm, focused, completely unaffected by the attention she had received earlier. Richard found that increasingly irritating. Most people enjoyed being noticed. Most people would have used the connection to Charles Whitmore as a conversation starter. Emily seemed uninterested in impressing anyone. You were still thinking about the waitress? One associate asked with a grin. Richard smirked. I am trying to figure out why everyone suddenly finds her so interesting. Another guest laughed. Maybe she has a secret life. The comment was intended as a joke, but it sparked an idea. Richard leaned back in his chair as a mischievous smile appeared. He enjoyed public challenges. More importantly, he enjoyed watching people fail under pressure. Across the room, the event coordinator continued introducing scholarship recipients and community leaders. Then she announced an unexpected addition to the program. Unfortunately, our scheduled guest speaker has experienced a travel delay and will not arrive tonight. A murmur spread through the audience. The coordinator maintained her smile. While we adjust the schedule, we would love to invite members of our community to share brief thoughts on education and opportunity. Richard's eyes lit up. Instantly, he saw an opportunity for entertainment. That sounds dangerous, one guest joked. Not if we choose carefully, Richard replied. At that moment, Emily approached the table carrying fresh coffee. Richard's smile widened. Actually, he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. I think we have the perfect speaker right here. Several heads turned immediately. Emily paused. Sir. Richard gestured dramatically toward the stage. You have been listening all evening. Why not share your thoughts with everyone? Laughter emerged from a few nearby tables. Emily remained polite. I do not think I am the right person for that. Why not? Richard pressed. Everyone has a story. Besides, this is a scholarship fundraiser. Surely you have opinions about education. More guests began watching. The attention spread through the room like a wave. Emily felt dozens of eyes settle upon her once again. Yet unlike before, she did not appear embarrassed. She simply stood quietly holding the coffee pot. Richard mistook her calmness for hesitation. Come on, he said with a confident grin. A few words. Unless public speaking is not your thing. The challenge hung in the air. Around the restaurant, conversations faded. Even the event coordinator looked uncertain. For a brief moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Then Emily looked toward the stage, then back at Richard. Her expression remained perfectly composed. If the organizers truly wish it, she said softly, I would be happy to speak. The smile on Richard's face grew wider. He believed he had just set the perfect trap. What he did not realize was that for the first time all evening, Emily had stopped avoiding the spotlight and chosen to step directly into it. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The soft jazz playing through the restaurant speakers seemed to fade into the background as every eye followed Emily. Richard sat back with complete confidence, convinced that he had orchestrated a harmless spectacle. In his mind, a waitress stepping onto a stage filled with executives, donors, and community leaders could only end one way. At best, she would stumble through a few nervous remarks. At worst, she would embarrass herself. Either outcome would provide the entertainment he was looking for. Emily carefully set down the coffee pot and handed it to another server. "Would you mind covering table 12 for a few minutes?" she asked quietly. Megan nodded immediately, though her eyes were wide with concern. "Are you sure about this?" Emily offered a small smile. "It will be fine." Across the dining room, whispers began spreading from table to table. Guests leaned toward one another, curious about what they were about to witness. Some expected a disaster. Others simply wanted to understand why Charles Whitmore had recognized her earlier. The event coordinator approached cautiously. "Miss Carter, you do not have to do this if you are uncomfortable." Emily looked toward the stage. "I am not uncomfortable." The answer was simple, calm, certain. Something about the way she said it caused the coordinator to hesitate. Most people placed in such a position would have shown anxiety. Emily appeared completely at ease. Richard noticed it too. The confidence bothered him more than he cared to admit. As Emily began walking toward the stage, the room grew quieter with every step. The chandeliers reflected softly against polished glass and silverware. Rain continued tapping against the windows overlooking the city skyline. Somewhere near the back, a chair shifted. Otherwise, the restaurant had become unusually still. Richard folded his arms and watched. "This should be interesting," he muttered. One of his associates laughed. "Maybe she has a prepared speech hidden somewhere." Richard smirked. "I doubt it." Emily reached the small staircase leading to the platform. For a moment, she paused near the grand piano. Her eyes moved across the room, taking in hundreds of faces. Wealthy donors, business leaders, attorneys, physicians, investors, people who spent their lives evaluating others within seconds of meeting them. She knew exactly what many of them saw when they looked at her. The uniform, the tray, the title of waitress. Nothing more. Yet there was no bitterness in her expression. No anger. Only composure. Near the entrance, another unexpected figure quietly stepped back into the restaurant. Charles Whitmore had returned. Few people noticed him take a seat at an empty table near the rear corner. He watched the stage carefully, almost as though he had been waiting for this exact moment. Emily finally stepped behind the microphone. The room fell completely silent. Richard smiled confidently and lifted his wine glass. He expected hesitation. He expected uncertainty. He expected the kind of nervousness that comes when ordinary people suddenly find themselves in extraordinary situations. What he did not expect was the look in Emily's eyes. Because in that moment, for the first time all evening, she did not look like someone who had wandered onto a stage. She looked like someone who belonged there. Emily rested her hands lightly on either side of the podium and looked across the dining room. The silence felt different now. It was no longer the silence of curiosity. It was the silence that comes when people expect someone to fail. She could feel it in the room. Yet her expression never changed. "Thank you for allowing me a few moments," she began. Her voice was clear, steady, and unexpectedly confident. Several guests exchanged glances immediately. This was not the nervous introduction they had anticipated. "Tonight is about education and opportunity," she continued. "Those two things changed my life many years ago." The room remained still. Richard lowered his wine glass slightly. He had expected hesitation. Instead, every word seemed measured and deliberate. "When I was 18 years old, I received a scholarship that made college possible. Without that support, I would never have had the chance to pursue the work I loved." A few guests nodded politely. It was a simple story so far. Nothing remarkable. Yet something in the way she spoke commanded attention. "I learned something important during those years," Emily continued. "Talent is distributed far more equally than opportunity." A hush settled over the room. Even the servers standing near the kitchen entrance stopped moving. Every year there are brilliant students whose potential goes unnoticed because people make assumptions. They look at a family income. They look at a neighborhood. They look at a job title. Sometimes they simply look at appearances. Richard shifted slightly in his chair. For the first time all evening, he felt an unfamiliar discomfort. Emily was not reading notes. She was not searching for words. She spoke with the ease of someone who had delivered important presentations many times before. Near the back of the restaurant, Charles Whitmore smiled quietly. He had seen this before. Years ago, long before anyone in this room knew Emily Carter's name. "One scholarship changed my future," Emily said. "That opportunity eventually allowed me to spend more than a decade researching educational development and student achievement." Several guests blinked in surprise. The statement landed softly, yet it immediately changed the atmosphere. Richard's smile faded. One of his associates looked toward him. "Research?" he whispered. Emily continued as though she had not noticed. "During those years, I worked with universities, nonprofit organizations, and educational institutions across the country. I met extraordinary young people who simply needed someone to believe in them." The room grew even quieter. The event coordinator stared at her in confusion. This was no ordinary fundraiser speech. This sounded like the perspective of an expert. "A few years ago," Emily said, "I stepped away from that work to care for my mother during a long illness. After she passed away, I chose a simpler life. I discovered that titles matter less than people think. Character matters more." Not a single glass moved. Not a single conversation continued. Richard could feel the room shifting around him. The assumptions he had made all evening were beginning to crack. Yet what unsettled him most was the realization that Emily was only beginning to reveal who she really was. And as she glanced briefly toward Charles Whitmore before returning her eyes to the audience, it became clear that the story everyone believed about the waitress standing on that stage was far from the truth. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire restaurant. No one had expected the evening to take this turn. Moments earlier, many of the guests had viewed Emily as part of the background, someone who carried plates and refilled glasses. Now they found themselves listening with complete attention. Emily allowed the silence to settle before continuing. "The work I loved eventually led me to a project that changed my life," she said. "A project focused on identifying overlooked talent in underfunded school districts." Several guests leaned forward. The event coordinator had stopped checking her notes entirely. Even the servers near the kitchen entrance stood motionless. Emily's calm voice carried effortlessly through the room. At the time, many experts believed academic success could be predicted by demographics and economic statistics. Our research suggested something very different. We discovered that exceptional potential exists everywhere. Richard no longer looked amused. His expression had become cautious. Something about her words sounded familiar. Across the room, Charles Whitmore remained completely still, watching with quiet pride. Emily continued. "The findings eventually became part of a national education initiative. That initiative now supports scholarship programs in more than 30 states." A murmur swept through the audience. Several people recognized the program immediately. It was one of the most respected educational efforts in the country. Millions of dollars had been invested into it over the years. Richard frowned. He knew the initiative well. His company had contributed funding to it on multiple occasions. The realization unsettled him. "Most people know the organization," Emily said. "Few know the names of the researchers who built the original framework behind it." She paused briefly. "That never bothered me. The work was always more important than recognition." Near the front of the room, one donor suddenly sat upright. His eyes widened. "Wait," he whispered to the woman beside him. "That cannot be possible." Others were reaching the same conclusion. Fragments of memory began surfacing. Academic journals, conference presentations, interviews from years ago, a name they had not heard in a long time. Emily glanced toward Charles Whitmore. The elderly philanthropist gave a small nod. It was all the encouragement she needed. "Years ago, before family responsibilities changed my priorities, I served as the lead researcher for that initiative." The room froze. Several guests stared at her in disbelief. One person quietly dropped a fork onto a plate. The sound echoed far louder than it should have. Richard felt the color drain from his face. "My name appeared on some of the early publications," Emily said. Emily Carter. A collective realization swept through the audience. The name was familiar. Not to everyone, but to enough people. She was not merely someone who had participated in the project. She had helped create it. Her research had influenced policy decisions, scholarship funding models, and educational strategies used throughout the country. The waitress standing behind the microphone was the very expert many professionals had studied for years. Richard stared at her speechless. For the first time all evening, he had nothing to say. And as whispers spread across the room and guests exchanged stunned glances, everyone began to understand that the story was even bigger than they had imagined. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The restaurant seemed suspended in a moment of collective disbelief. The rain continued tapping softly against the windows, but inside Hawthorne Steakhouse, even that sound felt distant. Emily stood calmly behind the microphone while the realization spread from table to table. Some guests searched their memories. Others quietly pulled out their phones. Within moments, names, articles, interviews, and academic citations began appearing on glowing screens across the dining room. The evidence was impossible to ignore. The woman many had assumed was simply a waitress had helped shape one of the most influential educational initiatives in modern America. A hush fell across the room. Richard stared at Emily as if seeing her for the first time. The confident smile he had worn all evening had disappeared completely. One of his associates leaned closer and whispered, "I remember reading her work during graduate school." Another nodded slowly. "So did I." The comments spread. "I attended one of her lectures years ago. Her research changed our scholarship model." She testified before a national education panel. Each statement landed like another piece of a puzzle finally falling into place. Near the back of the room, Charles Whitmore rose to his feet. His movement immediately drew attention. When one of the most respected philanthropists in the city stood, people noticed. He looked toward Emily with unmistakable admiration. Then he began to applaud. The sound echoed clearly through the silent restaurant. One pair of hands became 2, then 5, then 20. Within seconds, the entire room erupted into applause. Guests who had spent the evening ignoring her now stood from their chairs. The ovation grew louder and louder until it filled every corner of the dining room. Emily remained composed. She smiled gently but did not appear surprised. It was as though recognition had never been what mattered to her. Richard remained seated. The applause around him felt overwhelming. Every joke he had made earlier replayed in his mind. Every assumption. Every dismissive remark. For the first time in years, he found himself without an audience willing to laugh. He finally rose from his chair, but not because everyone else had. He stood because remaining seated felt impossible. Across the room, dozens of eyes shifted toward him. People remembered exactly how the evening had started. They remembered who had turned Emily into the target of a public joke. Richard opened his mouth as if searching for something to say, but no words came. The room had changed. The balance of respect had changed. And most of all, the story everyone believed when they walked into the restaurant had changed. Emily waited patiently until the applause softened. Then she looked across the crowd. Her gaze briefly met Richard's. There was no anger in her expression, no triumph, no desire to embarrass him. That quiet dignity somehow made the moment even more powerful. The room went silent once again, not because people doubted her, but because they suddenly understood they were witnessing something far more meaningful than a simple revelation. They were witnessing the complete collapse of a judgment that should never have been made in the first place. The applause gradually faded, but the feeling in the room remained. It lingered in the silence that followed, in the thoughtful expressions on faces that had arrived expecting an ordinary fundraiser and were leaving with something far more valuable. Emily stood quietly behind the microphone and waited until the last echoes disappeared. Then she spoke once more. "There is one final thing I would like to share." The room immediately settled. People often ask why I left my career. They assume there must have been some dramatic reason. The truth is much simpler. My mother spent the last years of her life needing daily care. She spent decades believing in me when nobody else did. When she needed me, I wanted to return that gift. A few guests lowered their eyes. Others nodded quietly. After she passed away, I realized something important. Achievement is meaningful. Success is meaningful. But neither of them defines a person's worth. Her gaze moved gently across the audience. The person serving your meal may have a story you cannot imagine. The person cleaning an office may possess knowledge that would impress an entire boardroom. The person you overlook today may have spent years changing lives without asking for recognition. No one moved. No one interrupted. Every word seemed to settle deeply into the room. Then Emily looked toward Richard. She did not single him out. She did not embarrass him. She simply included him among everyone else listening. We all make assumptions. I have made them too. What matters is whether we are willing to look beyond them. Richard felt the weight of those words more than anyone. Not because they were cruel. Quite the opposite. They offered him something he had not expected that evening: grace. The opportunity to learn instead of merely being judged. Charles Whitmore smiled softly from the back of the room. He had spent years funding educational programs because he believed talent could be found anywhere. Tonight, that lesson had been demonstrated more clearly than any speech or report could ever accomplish. Emily stepped away from the microphone. For a moment, nobody reacted. Then the applause returned, louder than before. People rose to their feet once again. This time it was not because of her accomplishments. It was because of her character. As guests stood, Richard slowly approached the stage. The room watched carefully. When he reached Emily, he extended his hand. "I owe you an apology," he said honestly. "I judged you before I knew anything about you." Emily accepted the handshake. "We all have moments we would like to do differently," she replied. "The important thing is what we learn from them." Richard nodded. There was nothing else to say. The lesson had already been delivered. Later that night, as guests departed into the cool Chicago rain, many carried a story they would share for years. Not a story about a famous researcher, not a story about a wealthy donor, but a story about dignity, about humility, about the danger of measuring people by appearances. And as the lights of the restaurant reflected across the wet city streets, one truth remained impossible to ignore. Greatness rarely announces itself. More often, it walks quietly through the world, waiting for others to see what was there all along.